The year was 1962, and Springfield, Illinois still carried the softness of a mid-century American town where front porches sagged gently with age, and the scent of lilac bushes drifted lazily through neighborhoods untouched by urgency. In those days, the sidewalks of Washington Park curved beneath towering oaks that shed their leaves in slow spirals, and the morning air held a calm that made even the smallest sound feel sacred. It was in this quiet place that once promised safety without question, that Michael Bennett spent his earliest days. He was only 13 months old, a bright, curious toddler with wide brown eyes and a head full of soft, curling hair that glowed amber in the sun. He was the kind of child who observed everything long before reaching toward it, who watched the flutter of birds or the shifting of shadows with the focus of someone twice his age. Neighbors often commented that he seemed unusually calm, unusually attuned to the world, as though even at that tender age he recognized something delicate in the air around him. His mother often took him on gentle morning walks through Washington Park, her hands steady on the stroller handle as dew gathered on the grass and sunlight trickled through the leaves in small, golden patches. Those walks were their ritual, quiet, predictable, intimate. But it was those very walks that wove the final threads of normalcy before the morning. Everything changed. Springfield had always believed itself insulated from the kind of tragedies that filled distant newspapers. Life moved at the pace of wind through cornfields, unhurried and unthreatened. Yet beneath that surface was a truth most towns never fully acknowledged, that even the safest places can harbor shadows, and even the gentlest mornings can fracture without warning. On the day Michael disappeared, the sky was a pale, cloudless blue that gave no hint of unrest. The park path was lined with benches, still slick from early moisture, and the lake reflected a near-perfect mirror of willow branches dipping low along the shore. A few joggers moved in slow arcs around the loop, their footsteps muffled by dirt paths and soft earth. Mothers gathered near the playground, exchanging small talk over thermoses of coffee. Every sound was ordinary, every detail familiar. Nothing seemed capable of shifting the rhythm of the day. But in the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found, a truth that would echo across decades, reshaping every memory of that morning. Later, investigators would walk those same winding paths, their shoes sinking into the same soft ground where Michael's stroller wheels once rolled. They would stand beneath those towering oaks, analyzing angles of visibility, distances between landmarks, and the way sound traveled across open parkland. They would try to reconstruct each second, each movement, each possibility. Yet even in those earliest moments of the investigation, something felt off, something that would haunt every attempt to piece together the events of that morning. For now, all anyone knew was that a child who had taken countless strolls through Washington Park vanished in a span so brief, so incomprehensible, it carved a permanent fault line through the community. His mother's footsteps, once steady and familiar, would forever be remembered for the frantic, uneven pattern they traced across the grass as she searched for him, calling for help from neighbors who dropped everything to respond. Within minutes, parkgoers shifted from their peaceful routines into a coordinated sweep of the woods, the playground, the lakeside, the walking trails. Within hours, detectives were combing through brush, draining ditches, interviewing every witness they could find. But before all of that, before the sirens, before the search parties, before the sleepless nights, there was simply a mother and her child walking through a park that had always felt safe. A moment so ordinary it should have faded with the passing of a single day. Instead, it became the opening line of a mystery that would linger for generations. As daylight stretched across Springfield and the truth remained painfully out of reach, one question began to settle like a cold wind in the hearts of everyone touched by the case. How could Michael Bennett disappear without a trace, in a place where everyone believed they were watching, listening, caring enough to notice anything out of place? But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? The morning after Michael Bennett's disappearance, Springfield woke beneath a sky that felt heavier than the day before, as if the air itself understood what had been lost. The soft blue of early daylight seemed muted, washed out, almost hesitant, to reveal the familiar shapes of houses, cottonwood trees, and the quiet grid of residential streets. Neighbors stepped onto porches with a deliberateness that suggested they already knew the world had shifted, even before the news reached every doorstep. The town, normally so steady, so predictable, felt suspended in a moment it could not yet understand. Michael's absence rippled through the Bennett home in ways too subtle for police reports to capture. His small toys remained arranged on the living room rug exactly as they had been the night before. A wooden duck tipped to one side as though waiting for his hands. A tiny pair of overalls hung on the back of a bedroom chair, one strap caught on the edge, swaying slightly in the draft of an open window. The crib, with its soft blue blanket folded neatly along the rail, seemed achingly untouched. In that stillness, the house held the shape of Michael's presence, even as the reality of his disappearance began sinking into the bones of everyone who loved him. For investigators, Section 2 of the story often becomes the space where normal life is examined under a magnifying lens, where each moment leading up to a disappearance is revisited and reinterpreted. In Springfield, that meant retracing the rhythms of the Bennett family's simple, everyday existence. They were a young couple just beginning to understand the balance between work and early parenthood, between exhaustion and wonder, between the endless needs of a toddler and the quiet hope that came with watching him grow. Their lives weren't flashy or complicated. They represented the best of the small-town ideal, modest, grounded, and deeply connected to the community around them. Michael's days had been filled with the kinds of small, tender details that parents often remember most vividly. The way he clapped when he heard music. The way he pressed his cheek against the shoulder of anyone holding him. How he sometimes stared, for long stretches of time, at dust motes turning slowly in the sunbeam that crossed the living room floor. He had just learned to balance on unsteady legs, taking small, wobbly steps from the sofa to his mother's waiting arms. His world was expanding in all the ways a toddler's does. New textures, new sounds, new fascinations. Every morning seemed to reveal something he hadn't noticed before. That was why those walks in Washington Park mattered so much. They were more than routine. They were a kind of gentle introduction to a broader world. His mother would guide the stroller along the curved paths while narrating the trees, the birds, the passing joggers. She pointed out squirrels darting up trunks, the metallic shine of playground swings, the way wind rippled across the lake's surface. For Michael, these were moments of discovery. For his mother, they were moments of connection. And for investigators, they became the foundation of understanding what had happened on that fateful morning in reconstructing the final days of Michael's life as they were known. Detectives spoke with neighbors, friends, even store clerks who remembered seeing the Bennetts during errands earlier that week. The portrait that emerged was painfully ordinary, which only deepened the sense of disbelief surrounding his disappearance. There were no arguments, no unusual events, no strange cars parked outside the home. Nothing that hinted at danger. Nothing that suggested the family had been watched or followed. Just a young couple doing their best, raising a child who brought softness and light into the lives around him. What investigators did notice, however, was the innocence with which Michael moved through the world, a quality that made the mystery even more unsettling. He was small, quiet, and easy to carry. He didn't cry easily, and he trusted completely. These characteristics made him especially vulnerable, and as police quietly acknowledged among themselves, they also made him tragically easy to take. That unspoken understanding cast a long shadow over every interview, every search effort, every silent moment spent scanning the park for any sign of him. As the community came together, subtle shifts in behavior began to reveal the psychological weight of the case. Parents held their children closer in grocery store aisles. Doors that were usually left unlocked were suddenly bolted shut. Normal routines, sending children to school, walking dogs after dark, lingering in the park, felt charged with new tension. Springfield's identity, once anchored in the comfort of familiarity, now wavered beneath the fear that something had invaded their safe world, something they did not understand. Meanwhile, investigators continued gathering every detail they could about the Bennett's life, searching for anything that might explain the inexplicable. They reviewed family schedules, traced recent movements, and listened carefully to every recollection of Michael's temperament, habits, and daily patterns. They cataloged these details not because they suspected the family, but because understanding Michael himself, his behaviors, his routines, his world, offered the best chance of uncovering what had happened. What emerged from all of that listening was a portrait of a child whose life should have continued unfolding in gentle, ordinary ways. A child who should have been pulling himself along the edge of the coffee table, learning new words, demanding favorite foods, toddling clumsily between rooms. Instead, his story had taken a turn that defied explanation, a turn that left investigators feeling both determined and profoundly unsettled. Yet even in those early days, as the search widened and hope flickered with each passing hour, there were small, quiet moments when residents believed that answers were still within reach, that someone had seen something, that a clue had been overlooked, that the truth, however elusive, was still close enough to grasp. And in the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. As the days stretched into weeks, Springfield's perception of normal life began to fray, revealing cracks where the innocence of routine had once seemed unbreakable. Michael Bennett's absence was no longer a momentary fear. It had become an omnipresent weight pressing on every street corner, every family gathering, every whispered conversation behind closed doors. People walked past Washington Park with careful, measured steps, eyes scanning for signs that had never existed before. The path where he had once toddled, the benches where mothers had rested, even the swings on the playground, all became silent markers of a world altered forever. Michael's last known movements remained frustratingly elusive. Investigators reconstructed the morning of his disappearance with painstaking precision, visiting the park multiple times, noting the angle of sunlight, the curve of paths, the proximity of trees, the distance between benches. They analyzed where his stroller had been left and how his mother's attention might have shifted for mere seconds. Those seconds were all it took. Those seconds had been swallowed by the park, like an invisible hand reaching across the years. Yet the small details of his life offered glimpses into the boy he was, moments that refused to be erased by tragedy. Michael had been on the cusp of new milestones, teetering on the threshold of independent exploration. At 30 months, he had begun taking steps along the hardwood floors of the Bennett home, wobbling toward the familiar shapes of furniture and family alike. He loved the soft hum of his mother's voice, the smell of morning toast, and the gentle rhythm of a lullaby sung at dawn. He had favorite toys: an unassuming wooden duck, a threadbare stuffed rabbit, and a small set of colorful blocks that could be stacked with precarious delight. These objects, left untouched in the quiet home, became haunting symbols of a life paused, a routine suspended. Neighbors recalled the rhythm of his interactions, the way he leaned against his father's leg for comfort, the fascination with light catching off the kitchen window, the excitement in his eyes when spotting a bird perched on a branch outside. Everyone who encountered Michael spoke of his serenity, the calmness that seemed almost beyond his years. Yet that very calm had made the suddenness of his disappearance all the more shattering. A child so attuned to his surroundings, so dependent on the familiar, had vanished from the world with no warning, leaving a void in the town's collective memory. For Michael's parents, the days following his disappearance were a series of sensory assaults, each one amplifying grief through tangible fragments of memory. His mother would touch the railing of the crib, trying to summon the warmth of his small body. His father would examine the small shoes left by the door, the socks folded neatly beside them, and imagine the last moments of play before the park walk. Every object became a trigger, every shadow a potential signal of his presence. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that a child who had known nothing but safety had been taken or lost in a place that had promised both. Investigators, meanwhile, began to notice patterns in witness statements that were initially overlooked. A jogger recalled seeing a man at the far end of the path who had lingered longer than expected, though the description was vague. Another mother reported a strange rustling in the reeds near the lake, though she had dismissed it at the time as wind. These details, minor in isolation, became threads to be woven into a tapestry of possibility. Police cataloged every comment, measured every distance, and sketched diagrams to reflect the minutiae of that morning. They understood that in cases involving a toddler, even the smallest lapse, a misstep, a distracted glance, a second of inattention could be critical dot as search efforts intensified. Volunteers from every corner of the town joined in. Farmers left fields unattended to trudge along muddy banks. Clerks abandoned counters to sweep parking lots and alleyways. Families walked every inch of Washington Park, calling Michael's name into the wind until voices cracked and throats burned. The community's hearts seemed to pulse with the hope of discovery. And yet every empty corner, every still pond, every silent stretch of path reinforced the magnitude of what had been lost. Psychologically, the town began to internalize the disappearance, shifting from shock to a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Parents watched their own children more closely. Neighbors locked doors they had never thought to lock, and even the familiar sight of the park became a source of caution. The serenity of a Midwestern morning, once taken for granted, now felt tenuous. Every footstep on a sidewalk, every bark of a dog, every distant hum of traffic seemed to echo with the memory of a boy who had vanished without trace. Michael's life, though brief, had been fully realized in ways that spoke to the innocence and vitality of early childhood. His curiosity, his gentle temperament, his attachment to family and the world around him, all these elements became central in understanding both the impact of his disappearance and the approach investigators would take in the coming years. These small human details were not just background. They were the lens through which the town processed grief, fear, and hope. Even as weeks turned into months, the memory of Michael Bennett remained vivid in the minds of Springfield residents. Each anniversary, each seasonal change, each glance at Washington Park brought recollections, both tender and painful. His parents clung to the fragments of normalcy that remained. A photograph of him clutching a blanket, the echo of his laughter and memory, the impression of tiny handprints left on windowsills. And beneath all of it, a quiet, unrelenting question lingered in the hearts of everyone who had known him. How does a child, so small, so beloved, simply disappear from the world? Decades later, one detail finally broke the silence, a detail that no one had expected, reshaping not only the investigation, but the collective memory of a town that had long wrestled with loss. But for now, the story remained suspended, held in the fragile tension between memory and mystery, in the quiet spaces where hope and despair intermingled. The moment Michael Bennett disappeared became a pivot point for Springfield, shifting the town from an ordinary rhythm to a state of relentless vigilance. Investigators approached Washington Park with methodical precision, combing every inch of grass, every shadowed cluster of trees, every banked curve along the lake's edge. They photographed, measured, and documented tirelessly, capturing the minutiae that might reveal what a toddler had seen, what a toddler had felt, and what the world had concealed in the moments before he vanished. The scene, so ordinary at first glance, was now a canvas of urgency and unanswered questions. Witness interviews dominated the early days. Neighbors remembered fleeting glances, a mother with a stroller at the edge of the path, a man sitting silently on a park bench, children playing and laughing, oblivious to the sudden tension gripping the town. Investigators noted discrepancies in timelines, shadows that seemed longer or shorter depending on the recounting, and the near impossible task of determining the span of seconds when a child could have been taken. Every recollection was scrutinized, every possibility logged, and yet the absence of Michael remained absolute, a void that resisted explanation. The Bennetts were placed at the center of a delicate balance between grief and investigation. Police treated them with respect, yet the unspoken reality of suspicion hovered at the edges of every encounter. They were victims, but their routines, their relationships, even their emotions, were dissected to trace the invisible trajectory that had carried Michael away. Detectives examined the house, the yard, the routes to the park, searching for any overlooked detail, an unlocked date, a misaligned latch, the footprints of a stranger in dew-slick grass. Each inquiry painted a more complex picture of vulnerability. Even in a town that had prided itself on safety, the physical investigation extended beyond the immediate park. Officers canvassed nearby streets, checked the edges of residential blocks, and spoke with every person who might have seen or heard something out of place. Local businesses provided ledgers, bus drivers recalled patterns, postal workers remembered interactions. Every piece of mundane activity was filtered through a lens of potential significance. And yet, despite the diligence, no definitive clue emerged. Michael's disappearance was a puzzle without its key, a question that the collective memory of Springfield could not yet answer. Community response was immediate and intense. Volunteers organized search parties, families joined in coordinated sweeps, and churches held vigils. The urgency was palpable, the fear collective. In small towns like Springfield, the disappearance of a child fractured a sense of security that had been taken for granted, leaving a lingering awareness that danger could exist even in familiar places. People were no longer casual observers. They became participants in a silent, desperate hunt for evidence, truth, and closure. Investigators relied on techniques that, in 1962, were at the forefront of procedural practice. Handwritten logs meticulously tracked each tip, each lead, each sighting. Sketches were drawn of potential suspects, timelines were cross-referenced, and local law enforcement coordinated with state authorities. Every method, from fingerprint analysis to tracing household routines, was applied rigorously. Yet the limitations of the era, no pervasive surveillance, no rapid communication, no digital footprint compounded the challenge. Each day stretched into nights filled with unanswered questions and painstakingly slow progress. For Michael's parents, the investigation was both a source of hope and a mirror of anguish. They were privy to fragments of potential leads, whispers of sightings, and early investigative assessments that offered glimmers of possibility but no certainty. Each development alternated between brief relief and deepened despair. Every new theory, every search, every avenue examined became a testament to the persistence of a community unwilling to surrender to uncertainty. Yet every dead end reinforced the cruel reality of their child's absence. Even the media, modest as it was in Springfield in 1962, played a subtle but powerful role. Reports in the local paper described the disappearance in calm, factual tones. But the language hinted at the collective anxiety. A toddler missing. A park that was supposed to be safe, the growing concern of parents across the county. Photographs of the boy, his soft curls, his curious eyes. His tiny hands were printed in stark black and white, a reminder of the life the town had lost and the innocence that remained suspended in memory. Investigators faced the cruel challenge of working within the confines of limited technology. No instant communication, no centralized databases, no digital record-keeping. Each lead had to be documented by hand, each tip logged manually, each search painstakingly organized. Yet within these constraints, a culture of meticulousness emerged, a dogged determination that would carry the investigation forward decade after decade. The town of Springfield, bound by geography and shared grief, became both witness and participant in a procedural choreography that sought to impose order on an event that seemed designed to defy understanding. Amid the search and investigation, the physical world of the park itself seemed unchanged, almost taunting. The same benches remained, the same paths wound through oak trees, the same lake reflected the shifting sky. It was as though the natural world had refused to acknowledge the fracture in human life that had occurred in its midst. The quiet corners, once filled with the laughter of children, now echoed with the absence of one. Investigators would later describe a sensation, difficult to quantify, of a place holding a secret, waiting, observing, offering only the barest hints of what had occurred. But the case was far from over. While the first searches yielded no concrete evidence, early leads hinted at possibilities that would take years to pursue. Witness statements suggested fleeting movements, overlooked details hinted at a larger puzzle, and the keen eyes of a few determined investigators saw patterns invisible to the casual observer. In the quiet of the park, beneath the oaks, along the pathways, the first whispers of truth were gathering, waiting to emerge in a way that no one yet anticipated. And in the shadows of Washington Park, where a small child had once toddled innocently, the town would learn that even the most ordinary places can harbor extraordinary mysteries. And that persistence would be the only hope of reclaiming what had been lost. Weeks passed, and the initial flurry of searches gave way to a grim routine of investigation and community vigilance. Springfield settled into a rhythm defined by absence, the absence of Michael Bennett, the absence of clarity, the absence of peace. Detectives continued their methodical work, cataloging every possible lead, retracing paths, and attempting to reconstruct the timeline of a day that had already become mythic in its ambiguity. Each avenue explored seemed to converge on the same unsettling truth. Michael had vanished without leaving a discernible trace. Officers revisited the park again and again, each time noting the way sunlight slanted through the oaks, the shadows shifting over the same benches, the rustle of leaves in the wind. They measured distances meticulously, considering how far a toddler could have wandered, how quickly an abductor might have acted, how imperceptibly the world could change in the space of a single minute. They drew diagrams of the stroller's last known location, recorded the footprints of volunteers in damp soil, and interviewed anyone who had passed through the park that morning. Every detail was important, yet no concrete evidence emerged. The community, too, became a living network of observation. Parents walked children in groups, exchanging nervous glances when small toddlers strayed too far. Neighbors monitored each other's yards, unconsciously measuring the distance between safe and unsafe. Local store clerks recalled moments of fleeting attention, an unfamiliar car parked too long, a shadow lingering in a window, and shared these memories with police. In small towns, everyone knew everyone, and the disruption caused by Michael's disappearance magnified the ordinary into something intensely scrutinized. Every passerby was both witness and participant in a silent, anxious vigilance. Investigators turned their attention to patterns that might explain the disappearance. They considered routine traffic through the park, nearby construction sites, and homes bordering Washington Park. They checked local employment rosters, questioned delivery men, and reviewed mail routes, attempting to understand whether someone from outside the community might have observed or targeted Michael. Detectives pored over the Bennett's daily life with clinical precision, seeking any possible interaction or vulnerability. Yet everything pointed to the ordinary, the normal rhythms of a young family in a seemingly safe town. Early forensic techniques were limited, but every tool available was deployed. Officers photographed the park extensively, mapped every tree and bush, and recorded soil impressions. They measured the depth of footprints, the spacing of tire tracks, and even the subtle depressions in grass where someone might have knelt. Handwritten notes logged every tip, every recollection, every minor inconsistency in witness statements. While technology would later revolutionize such investigations, in 1962, the work required patience, persistence, and painstaking attention to detail. As days turned into months, the investigation became a psychological exercise as much as a physical one. Detectives walked the park alone at night, imagining the sequence of events through the eyes of a child. They considered the sounds that would have been audible in the early morning: the distant whistle of a train, the call of a crow, the shifting of leaves and wind. They assessed the likelihood of a stranger approaching unnoticed, of a child wandering off, of an abduction occurring without confrontation. Each scenario was weighed, tested against timelines and witness accounts, and yet none fully accounted for the absence of the boy. The emotional weight of the case intensified for Michael's parents. His mother retraced the park paths daily, hoping for some trace, some mark of his presence. She carried photographs of him, tucked into a worn envelope, showing the curl of his hair, the expression in his eyes, the small hand lifted in mid-gesture. Every familiar object in the home crib, stroller, toys became a touchstone for memory, a fragile tether to the child who had once moved through the space with quiet curiosity. His father walked the neighborhood, speaking quietly with neighbors, scanning every shadow for signs of what had occurred. Their grief, tightly bound with hope, oscillated between desperate panic and numb despair. Community meetings became forums for both shared sorrow and collective resolve. The town's residents collaborated to organize volunteer patrols, establish phone chains for missing children alerts, and reinforce a network of observation designed to prevent future tragedies. Springfield, once defined by the leisurely cadence of small-town life, had transformed into a town acutely aware of its own fragility. People who had once assumed safety now moved with caution, each action shaped by the haunting absence of one child. Even as leads dried and months turned into years, investigators refused to abandon the case. They revisited witness statements, checked previous tips against new information, and sought overlooked details in the hopes of uncovering patterns invisible during initial investigations. They knew that in cases involving toddlers, the window for finding critical evidence could close quickly. Yet something in the small gestures of the boy's life, the way he observed, the way he trusted, the way he navigated the ordinary world suggested that a careful, persistent approach might yet yield answers. The haunting truth of Michael Bennett's disappearance settled over Springfield like the heavy fog that often lingered over the Illinois River in early morning hours. It became a story passed quietly among neighbors, retold in subdued tones in classrooms, churches, and diners. The boy who had toddled through Washington Park was gone, yet his memory persisted, a living presence in the consciousness of a town unwilling to let him fade. In the quiet corners of this small town, investigators knew the first breakthrough could come from a detail no one had yet considered, a memory no one had yet revisited, a clue overlooked in the rush of early searches. And decades later, one piece of evidence would emerge, changing everything. Years settled over Springfield like layers of dust, thickening the quiet streets and leaving a town haunted by memory. Michael Bennett's disappearance, though long past, refused to fade. The park where he had last been seen remained meticulously preserved, not by law, but by the collective consciousness of a community unwilling to forget. Children still played there, their laughter bright against the dull hum of time, while parents carried the tension of vigilance learned too late. Investigators, now older, more experienced, returned intermittently, tracing old paths with new eyes, combing through the files that had accumulated over months and years. The dot it was in the slow unraveling that overlooked clues began to surface. A witness who had once dismissed a strange glint near the park's edge recalled it decades later. A fragment of metal, a piece of a toy, a glimmering object half buried in soil. Seen for mere seconds, but etched in memory. Another resident remembered a low, unfamiliar vehicle parked on a side street at an unusual hour. Its license plate misremembered, but its presence lodged in subconscious attention. Even the smallest anomalies, the misplacement of a park bench, an oddly tilted lamppost, a faint track through damp earth, were re-examined under modern forensic scrutiny. These details, previously unconnected, now began to form a web of possibility. Advancements in forensic science brought new tools to bear. Photographs were digitally enhanced, fingerprints reanalyzed, and material traces once thought irrelevant were subjected to chemical tests with precision unavailable in 1962. Investigators revisited the chronology of that morning with a rigor that married memory and technology, replotting lines of sight, calculating the speed of movement, and mapping areas of concealment. In small, painstaking increments, the mystery began to take shape, though it remained stubbornly incomplete. The psychological landscape of Springfield, too, began to shift. Families who had endured the trauma of Michael's disappearance carried the weight of his absence in subtle, enduring ways. Parents remembered the fragility of daily life, the thin margin between safety and calamity. Grandparents shared stories to children who had grown up unaware of the original events, planting in them both curiosity and unease. The town's narrative, once anchored in ordinary routine, was now intertwined with vigilance, memory, and the slow, persistent ache of loss. Detectives combed through decades-old witness statements with renewed intensity, searching for inconsistencies and overlooked details. One interview revealed that a man had been seen following a group of children near the park, something that, at the time, had seemed innocuous, but now took on significance. Another witness recalled a discarded object, initially ignored, that could now be matched to a set of items cataloged as missing evidence. Each fragment, examined anew, created connections that had been invisible within the immediate chaos of the original investigation. Even in this renewed scrutiny, investigators understood the importance of perspective. Children's movements are unpredictable, toddlers' routines fragile. Every calculation of distance or timing was weighted with allowances for variability. Michael's own curiosity and calm temperament made him both observant and vulnerable. Understanding the human dimension was as critical as the technical, for it was in the interplay of behavior, environment, and circumstance that the first breakthroughs would emerge. Community memory became an invaluable resource. Residents, now decades older, spoke with a clarity shaped by reflection rather than immediacy. Patterns once overlooked, the man on the bench, the glimmer of metal, the odd vehicle, were corroborated by multiple sources. The detective team cross-referenced old logs with these recollections, discovering alignments that suggested new avenues for investigation. In this way, Springfield itself became a participant in the case. A town whose collective attention had, over time, gathered evidence that had evaded formal notice. The emotional impact on Michael's parents remained profound. Their hope had transformed from immediate expectation to a slow, enduring longing for answers. Every newly uncovered clue, every reconsidered witness statement was both balm and torment. The desire to know what had truly happened clashed with the fear of discovering a reality too difficult to bear. Yet they persisted, clinging to the possibility that the years themselves had preserved truths long forgotten, waiting only for patient eyes to uncover them. And here, as the investigation pressed forward, a crucial question emerged, not just for the investigators or the family, but for anyone who had lived through the unresolved trauma of that morning. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? In the quiet spaces where time and memory intertwined, the case teetered on the brink of revelation. Every overlooked fragment, every hesitant recollection, every painstaking measurement was part of the slow, deliberate accumulation of evidence. The threads of possibility were gathering, ready to be woven into the pattern that would finally, decades later, reveal the truth that Springfield had waited for so long. As the investigation re-entered its investigative momentum, the quiet persistence of Springfield itself became a repository of forgotten details. Old photographs of Washington Park, faded and dog-eared, were scrutinized alongside maps and witness sketches. Tiny inconsistencies, once dismissed as irrelevant, suddenly seemed significant. A swing slightly out of alignment, the angle of a shadow in a black-and-white photograph, a solitary footprint by the lakeshore that had been overlooked in the chaos of early searches. These were the silent witnesses, preserved by time, waiting for scrutiny capable of connecting them to the events of that morning. Forensic specialists brought tools that had been unimaginable in 1962. Trace evidence was re-examined with high resolution. Imaging, allowing investigators to detect residues invisible to the naked eye. Fibers, soil fragments, and even minute impressions on objects from the park became key pieces in reconstructing the trajectory of Michael Bennett's last known movements. Decades-old witness statements were revisited, cross-referenced, and analyzed with a level of rigor that revealed correlations previously obscured by incomplete records or the pressure of urgency. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not yet complete, but coherent enough to guide the next phase of inquiry. Witnesses who had originally been hesitant to come forward now shared memories with a clarity that only time could provide. A neighbor, recalling the morning with newfound precision, remembered the distinctive sound of a vehicle's engine idling at the edge of the park, a noise once dismissed as ordinary traffic. Another spoke of a fleeting glimpse of a man carrying an object that, with hindsight, could have been the stroller. Investigators began to recognize the value of cumulative perception, decades of recollection, refining the focus on a momentary disturbance in the town's otherwise steady rhythm. Patterns emerged not only in witness accounts, but also in the physical evidence, small signs that had once appeared isolated now taking on a collective significance. Soil analysis suggested movement along routes previously thought untraveled. Items cataloged during the initial investigation were matched to newly identified traces. Even the minutiae of the direction leaves were disturbed. The compression of damp earth beneath an unnoticed step began to map a sequence of events. The scene of the disappearance, long silent, was yielding information that time had preserved. Through this painstaking process, Springfield became more than a backdrop. It was a participant in reconstruction. Residents were interviewed multiple times, their perspectives shifting with memory and reflection. Investigators recognized that people who had been peripheral witnesses in 1962 now held insights shaped by years of observation, reflection, and subconscious retention. One mother, recounting the play of light through the oaks, identified the exact spot where shadows had concealed a movement once invisible. Another, thinking back to the early morning mist, recalled a small detail about the direction of an approaching figure. In the quiet, layered accumulation of testimony, the town itself was revealing the contours of a long-concealed truth. Michael's parents, still living with the tension of unresolved grief, participated in this renewed examination with cautious hope. Each piece of corroboration offered both relief and trepidation. Relief that progress was possible, trepidation that the revelations might confirm fears they had long carried in silence. Their memories, too, became crucial, providing context for investigators to interpret the minutiae and to connect human behavior with physical traces. The intimate knowledge of Michael's temperament, habits, and routines guided reconstruction efforts, allowing investigators to model the likely paths he could have taken and the vulnerabilities he might have encountered. As evidence accumulated, the question of accountability loomed. The careful threading of witness memory, forensic reconstruction, and environmental mapping suggested that Michael's disappearance had not been entirely random. Certain behaviors and sequences of movement implied intention, patterns of observation, and subtle intervention. These were the silent markers that decades of meticulous examination could now bring into focus, revealing a choreography of actions previously invisible to hurried investigators or frightened witnesses. The cumulative effect of these breakthroughs was both technical and psychological. Investigators understood that they were no longer working with incomplete fragments, but with a coherent, evolving picture. The town's memory, the physical environment of the park, and the enduring patience of a family united by hope were converging. Yet even with these advances, the human cost remained raw. Michael Bennett's absence was a wound felt in every conversation, in every careful glance toward the park, in every routine walk that now carried a subtle caution. And once again, as the investigation gained clarity, the enduring question arose. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? It was in these moments, where reflection, patience, and persistence met, that the case began to approach a turning point. Every overlooked detail, every faded memory, every trace preserved by time now converged toward a revelation that Springfield had long awaited, one that would finally cast light on the long shadow of a missing child. The breakthrough came quietly, as breakthroughs often do, without fanfare or announcement. It began with a single overlooked fragment, a small object retrieved from the park during the earliest searches, cataloged and then set aside. Decades later, with modern analysis, that fragment revealed an imprint, a clue long invisible to the human eye. Investigators recognized its significance immediately. This tiny piece of evidence opened a pathway to reconstructing the final moments of Michael Bennett's life with a clarity previously unimaginable. The park, long silent and patient, seemed suddenly alive with possibility. Re-examination of witness testimony provided context for the fragment. One observer, now in the comfort of hindsight, recalled a brief, unexplained movement near the lakeshore, a figure bending down for no apparent reason. Another described a stroller slightly out of place, though at the time it had seemed natural. These statements, once isolated and ambiguous, now aligned with forensic data to form a coherent narrative. Slowly, meticulously, investigators began to trace the sequence of events that had gone unnoticed for decades. The reconstruction revealed that Michael had not wandered alone, nor had his disappearance been the product of a single random act. The evidence suggested someone had approached him with intent, exploiting the brief gap between a mother's attention and the ordinary distractions of a busy park. The fragment found decades later, once dismissed as inconsequential, became the linchpin in understanding how a child so small, so visible, could vanish without leaving a trace. The quiet, calculated precision of the act was chilling in its ordinariness, an almost imperceptible intrusion into a world that had once felt wholly safe. As the investigation continued, additional evidence emerged to corroborate the reconstructed timeline. Soil analysis matched the path inferred from witness accounts. Tire impressions suggested a vehicle briefly stationed nearby. Faint fibers confirmed proximity to objects carried by the child. Each piece reinforced the emerging picture. Michael's disappearance had been neither accidental nor entirely unobserved. The orchestration was subtle, executed in a manner that exploited the inherent vulnerabilities of a child in a public space. For Michael's parents, these revelations were both devastating and relieving. Relief came from understanding that the disappearance had not been random, that their child had not simply drifted from the world unnoticed. Devastation came from the realization that someone had taken advantage of his innocence, someone who had calculated movements with the precision of cold intent. Their grief, which had persisted quietly for decades, intensified in waves, each revelation demanding a reevaluation of memory and emotion. The community, too, felt the reverberations. Springfield's collective memory, once anchored in confusion and speculation, now aligned around a clearer understanding of what had occurred. The sense of vulnerability that had settled over the town all those years ago returned, tempered by knowledge. There was no relief in discovery, only the solemnity of understanding. The innocence of Washington Park had been compromised, the comfort of daily routine forever altered. Yet clarity brought a form of closure that absence could never provide. In the investigative sphere, this newfound clarity prompted renewed efforts to identify the perpetrator. Patterns in local records, previously overlooked connections between individuals frequenting the park, and cross-references with other minor incidents suggested possible leads. Law enforcement, armed with both modern tools and decades of meticulous archival work, pursued these leads with a determination sharpened by time. Each interview, each analysis, each step forward was infused with the intensity of finally grasping the contours of an event that had haunted a community for generations. Emotionally, the weight of decades lifted in small increments. Witnesses, once unsure of the significance of their recollections, now provided confirmations that strengthened the case. The town itself, though scarred, began to transform grief into purposeful vigilance. Families adjusted routines not out of fear, but from the hard-earned knowledge of what could occur when ordinary life intersects with unseen danger. Michael's disappearance, once a symbol of helplessness, had become a catalyst for understanding, preparedness, and resilience. But the revelations carried another layer, one almost imperceptible yet profoundly human. The recognition of Michael's presence in every detail reconstructed. His habits, his curiosity, his quiet attentiveness, all the qualities that made him so loved, shaped the trajectory of the investigation. Investigators often remarked that understanding the child, not just the circumstances, was central to unlocking the mystery. It was in the lens of his behavior, his temperament, and his innate trust that the final sequence of events could be discerned. And so, after decades of uncertainty, fragments of memory, and painstaking analysis, the truth began to emerge. The image of a toddler quietly exploring the park, a momentary distraction, an unseen figure, each piece fit into a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. In the quiet corners of Springfield, in the very paths Michael had toddled along, a narrative had been restored, fragile but coherent, revealing the contours of a day that had once seemed inscrutable. The community braced itself for the next stage, the revelation of the person responsible, the confrontation with reality, the reckoning that comes when decades of mystery give way to truth. And in that moment, the town understood that even the smallest fragment, overlooked and forgotten, could carry the weight of history and bring a measure of understanding long deferred. The revelation that Michael Bennett's disappearance had not been random sent shockwaves through Springfield, reverberating in both public consciousness and private grief. Investigators, now armed with decades of patient reconstruction, had identified a sequence of actions, a subtle orchestration, and ultimately, a suspect whose presence had been obscured by the ordinary rhythms of the town. The meticulous re-examination of old evidence, soil impressions, fragments of material. Witness recollections and patterns of movement converged to form an undeniable picture. The child's disappearance was no longer a mystery, but a narrative of deliberate and calculated intrusion. Authorities moved carefully, aware that decades had softened memories, that time had eroded some details, and that the suspect's patterns had changed. Interviews were conducted with precision, cross-referencing historical activity with contemporary recollections. The process demanded patience and empathy, recognizing that those involved had lived through trauma and uncertainty for generations. As investigators reconstructed interactions and timelines, the town collectively held its breath, watching history unfold with the tension of knowing that closure could finally be within reach. The emotional fallout was immediate and profound. Michael's parents, having carried the ambiguous weight of grief for so long, were confronted with truths both relieving and agonizing. Relief came in understanding that the disappearance had been an orchestrated act, not a lapse of attention or an accidental wandering. Anguish returned in knowing the calculated nature of the act, the deliberate targeting of innocence, and the cruel manipulation of circumstance. Every day, every detail from decades past became a testament to both vulnerability and resilience. Their quiet mourning transformed into an active engagement with the investigative process, their memories serving as vital touchstones for verification and insight. The town of Springfield responded with a mix of sorrow, disbelief, and resolve. The local community, shaped by decades of collective anxiety and unanswered questions, absorbed the revelations with an understanding born of lived experience. Parents walked paths they had known for years with a renewed awareness. Their children's movements now watched with cautious attentiveness. Conversations revisited the past, recollections sharpened with hindsight, and the shared grief of decades found both focus and direction. The disappearance of a single toddler had shaped the psyche of an entire community, and now, after so many years, the contours of truth began to offer clarity. Investigators pursued the suspect, gathering corroborating evidence and building a case from both physical traces and historical accounts. Tire tracks, soil displacement, witness observations, and subtle anomalies in behavior coalesced to form a clear, prosecutable chain of events. The passage of time, while complicating certain aspects, also provided perspective, revealing patterns and consistencies invisible in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. In these revelations, both procedural and human dimensions converged, illuminating the deliberate nature of what had once seemed incomprehensible. The psychological impact of these discoveries was layered. Springfield residents, long accustomed to the unresolved tension of Michael's disappearance, experienced a mixture of vindication and lingering unease. They understood now that the innocence of ordinary spaces could be violated. That vigilance was not paranoia but necessity, and that even the smallest actions, momentary distractions, unnoticed figures, could carry profound consequences. Yet alongside the weight of understanding came a measure of solace, the recognition that patience, persistence, and careful reconstruction had brought the story into focus. For Michael's parents, the decades of searching, remembering, and hoping culminated in a complex reconciliation with reality. The memories of their child, vivid and tender, were now contextualized within a narrative that explained, in part, the unthinkable. Each photograph, each toy, each fragment of memory, once painful reminders of absence, became evidence of the life that had been present, a life whose contours now guided understanding. The act of remembering transformed from futile longing into a structured, evidence-informed recollection. Anchoring grief in narrative, rather than mystery. Community healing began cautiously, shaped by acknowledgement rather than forgetfulness. Springfield could not erase what had occurred, but it could integrate the understanding into its collective consciousness. Schools incorporated lessons about vigilance, empathy, and historical awareness. Parents shared the story with caution, emphasizing the importance of awareness while honoring the dignity of the child whose life had been disrupted. Public spaces, once neutral and benign, now bore the imprint of history. The quiet reminder that even ordinary paths could harbor extraordinary stories dot and in the shadows of Washington Park. Beneath the oaks that had witnessed both innocence and absence, the truth settled into place. The investigation, painstaking and methodical, had transformed the intangible ache of decades into a coherent, humanly comprehensible narrative. Michael Bennett's disappearance, once a lingering wound in the fabric of the town, had become a testament to persistence, memory, and the capacity for truth to emerge, even across the span of generations dot as the final pieces fell into alignment. The lingering tension that had defined Springfield for so long began to shift. Questions of what had happened gave way to reflection on resilience, care, and the enduring bonds of family and community. The dark corners of memory were illuminated not by ease or comfort, but by the persistent light of discovery, a light that would guide the town and the family forward, quietly, without erasing the past, but giving it meaning. Springfield, after decades of carrying the invisible weight of a single morning in 1962, finally exhaled a quiet, collective breath. The narrative of Michael Bennett's disappearance, once suspended in uncertainty, had been reconstructed with painstaking care. Each fragment of evidence, each faded memory, each overlooked detail now forming a coherent, if painful, whole. In the wake of discovery, the town faced the delicate task of reconciling grief with understanding, absence with presence, mystery with clarity. Michael's parents, their faces etched by the passage of decades, walked Washington Park with renewed focus. The paths where he had once toddled, the benches where his mother had rested, and the lake's still reflection carried both memory and evidence. Each step was a measured engagement with the past, a negotiation between what was lost and what had been revealed. They touched familiar surfaces, imagined the soft curl of his hair, the subtle tilt of his head as he observed the world. Their grief remained, but it was now intertwined with understanding grief, tempered by the knowledge that their child's disappearance had a story, a sequence of events, a traceable human cause. The broader community felt the impact in quieter, cumulative ways. Parents guided children along the park paths with mindfulness born in experience. Neighbors spoke of vigilance not as fear, but as stewardship. The collective memory of Springfield had absorbed tragedy and transformed it into knowledge, a blueprint for awareness and care. Children played, yes, but within a landscape now, informed by history, a landscape that had once been neutral, but was now layered with both caution and remembrance. Investigators reflected on the decades-long journey with a sense of solemn accomplishment. They had navigated gaps in memory, limitations of technology, and the fragility of human recollection to uncover a narrative that had eluded immediate understanding. The work had demanded patience, empathy, and rigor. In the reconstruction of that single extraordinary morning, they had demonstrated the capacity of methodical persistence to illuminate truths long obscured. Each fragment of evidence, once dismissed or forgotten, had been vital, and each witness's recollection, sharpened by hindsight, had contributed to the revelation. Yet the human dimension remained central. Michael Bennett was never reduced to a statistic, never flattened into the abstraction of a case file. His temperament, curiosity, calm demeanor, and tender attentiveness shaped both the investigation and the narrative of loss. He remained, in memory and in reconstruction, a full human presence, a child whose life, even though brief, radiated influence across a community, guiding the careful attention that ultimately uncovered the truth. The emotional landscape of Springfield settled into a tentative equilibrium. The town, scarred but resolute, integrated the knowledge into daily life without allowing it to define every interaction. Families walked with awareness, neighborhoods remained watchful, and public spaces retained a layer of narrative previously absent. The tragedy had transformed both understanding and empathy, revealing the delicate balance between innocence, vigilance, and communal responsibility. For the Bennett family, closure was not a tidy resolution, but a layered acceptance. The mystery of Michael's disappearance had been resolved in terms of understanding, evidence, and accountability, but the tenderness of his absence remained a quiet ache that would endure. They carried both grief and relief, memory and clarity in equal measure. Photographs, toys, and the intangible traces of his presence became bridges between past and present, symbols of a life brief but profoundly felt. Springfield's history, once punctuated by uncertainty, now contained the contours of truth. The community's vigilance, memory, and persistence had allowed the narrative to unfold, transforming decades of anxious speculation into a coherent story. The quiet corners of Washington Park, once witnesses to uncertainty, now held both memory and evidence, a testament to the endurance of both place and human attention. In reflecting on the case, investigators, residents, and family alike recognize that resolution is rarely absolute. It is a negotiation between knowledge and memory, between what occurred and what endures in the human heart. Michael Bennett's disappearance, now understood in its full context, remained a source of reflection, sorrow, and reverence, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience. And so, Springfield moved forward, not untouched, not unscarred, but informed, vigilant, and marked by the enduring presence of a child who had quietly shaped a community's conscience. The story of Michael Bennett, reconstructed with care and respect, became more than a case. It became a testament to the persistence of memory, the patience of investigation, and the delicate, unwavering bond between a family, a town, and the child they had never stopped remembering.